Hey guys, today I bring you an impactful story of overcoming and transformation. Let's learn about the story of Malachi Hollis, a man who went through a near-death experience and had a frightening vision about the future. Get ready, because what he saw for November 2024 will make you rethink everything. Before I start, I want to know where you are watching from, so comment what city you are from. And of course, don't forget to subscribe to the channel so you don't miss any of these surprising stories. My name is Malachi Hollis, and I am 45 years old. I never thought I would be here telling this story, but I feel like I need to share what happened to me. I'm not a writer nor a speaker. I'm just someone who went through something that completely changed my life. I was born and raised in Richmond, Virginia, a city that holds a lot of history, but for me it has always been a place of difficult memories. I come from a dysfunctional family. My parents separated when I was a child, and I grew up with my mother, Lillian. Our relationship has never been easy. She was a bitter woman who seemed to see in me all the mistakes she had made in life. In our house, talking about God or religion was practically prohibited. My mother scoffed at any manifestation of faith, saying it was a thing for weak people. I grew up with this spiritual void, trying to fill it in every way possible. For a long time, I lived a life without direction. I left school early, jumped from job to job, got involved with the wrong people and substances that made me temporarily forget the emptiness I felt. It was like I was always looking for something, but I didn't know exactly what. I reached the age of 30 completely lost. My relationship with my mother continued to be toxic, and I sank deeper into addictions and self-destructive behaviors. It was around this time that I started hearing voices. These weren't drug-induced hallucinations. It was something different, darker, a presence that promised to solve all my problems if I just called upon it. And that's how I reached the lowest point in my life. One night, after an overdose, I had an experience that changed everything. Some call it a near-death experience. Others may say it was just my mind playing tricks. But I know exactly what I experienced. It was too real to be just a hallucination. What happened that night made me question everything I believed in, or rather, everything I didn't believe in. Before I tell you what happened, I need to make it clear. I'm not here to convert anyone or sell an idea. I just want to share my story, exactly how it happened, because maybe, just maybe, it can help someone who is going through what I went through. That night started like so many others. I was in my apartment, alone, trying to escape my own thoughts with drugs and alcohol. I don't know exactly what time it was when I realized something was wrong. My heart started beating in a strange, irregular way, and I felt a pressure in my chest that I had never felt before. I remember thinking, this time I overdid it, bae, but I couldn't do anything about it. It was then that everything started to get blurry. It was like I was being pulled out of my own body. At first, I felt an inexplicable lightness, as if I were floating. I can clearly remember looking down and seeing my body slumped on the couch. It's hard to explain this feeling, seeing yourself from the outside, as if you were someone else. My face was pale, my lips were purple, and there was an expression of anguish that scared me. But this feeling of lightness didn't last long. Suddenly, I was enveloped by a darkness unlike anything I had ever experienced. It wasn't like closing my eyes or being in a dark room. It was a living darkness that seemed to pulse and move around me. The air, if I can call it that, was heavy, suffocating. There was a smell I can't describe, a mixture of decay and despair. And then I started to hear the sounds. At first they were just distant murmurs, but they turned into moans and screams of agony. Voices that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at the same time. Some were begging for help. Others were screaming in languages I didn't know, but I could feel the desperation in every sound. That's when I realized I wasn't alone in that darkness. There were shadows moving around me, shapes that looked human but were distorted, as if they had been stretched and twisted. Your eyes. I'll never forget those eyes. They were empty, but at the same time, they were overflowing with a hunger that chilled my soul. They watched me. They got closer, and I could feel their evil intentions. "You belong to us now," they said in unison, their voices reverberating inside my mind. It was as if they could see every sin I had ever committed, every moment of weakness, every wrong choice, and they delighted in it. They fed on my fear and my despair. I tried to scream, but no sound came out. I tried to run, but there was nowhere to go. The darkness was infinite, and those presences were everywhere. It was as if all the evil I had ever done in my life was there, staring me in the face, ready to collect its debt. Amidst that suffocating darkness, the scenery changed abruptly. I found myself in a kind of train station, but it was nothing like the stations we know. It was a place that defied all logic and reason, where the very laws of physics seemed to have been distorted by an evil force. The walls, if I can call them that, seemed to breathe and pulse, as if they were made of living flesh. Occasionally, agonized faces would form on them, opening mouths in silent screams, only to dissolve back into the morbid surface. The ground beneath my feet was solid, but it had a disturbing organic texture. Each step produced a viscous sound, as if he was walking on something alive. In some places, the floor seemed to give way slightly, as if threatening to swallow anyone passing by. Dark marks spread across the floor, forming patterns that resembled ancient, forbidden symbols. The lighting was particularly disturbing, a sickly, yellowish light that seemed to emanate from nowhere. It was as if the air itself was sick, giving off a feverish glow. The shadows that this light cast moved in the wrong way, as if they had a mind of their own. Sometimes these shadows seemed to reach out towards people, like dark fingers trying to grab them. There were others there, lost souls, I thought. Some were almost transparent, like faded photographs of people. Others were more solid but had a distorted appearance, as if they had been broken and put back together wrong. Their gazes were blank, lost in a horror only they could see. They carried strange objects, books whose pages seemed written in blood, amulets that gave off a sickly glow, mirrors that reflected nothing but darkness. "Welcome to the station of the end," said a husky voice beside me. I turned around and saw a figure that appeared to have been partially consumed by shadows. Half his face was still human, though ravaged by suffering. The other half was pure darkness. "This is where we all wait our turn to leave for even worse places." "How long?" I started to ask, but he interrupted me with a bitter laugh. "Time? There is no time here as you know it. Some of us have been here for what seems like centuries. Others have just arrived, but in the end it makes no difference. Eternity is the same for everyone." A sound echoed through the station, a noise that was a grotesque mixture of a train whistle and a human scream. The ground began to shake, and people, or whatever those entities were, began to move towards the platform. Then I saw the train approaching, and my horror reached new levels. It wasn't a normal train. It was a twisted mass of dark metal that looked like it had been forged in hell itself. Its surface was covered with reliefs that resembled faces in agony, and from its junctions a dark liquid that looked like corrupted blood leaked. The windows were like black eyes, deep and evil, that seemed to watch every soul on the platform with an ancient and insatiable hunger. The door opened with a sound that mixed the creaking of metal with a groan of pain. A wave of foul air invaded the platform, bringing with it the whispers of dozens of tormented voices. "All aboard," announced a voice that seemed to come from all directions at once. "The train to the abyss is leaving." I felt an invisible force pushing me in, as if the train itself was sucking me in. I tried to resist, but it was useless. As I was dragged into the metallic horror, I heard the half-consumed figure say its last words, "Don't fight." Here, resistance only makes everything more painful. The interior of the train was even more disturbing than its exterior. The seats seemed to be made of a material that resembled putrefied flesh, and the corridor snaked impossibly, as if the space inside the train obeyed no natural law. The air was heavy and smelled indescribably, a mix of decay, sulfur, and something deeper and more evil that my mind refused to process. It was during this hellish trip that something even more disturbing happened. Among the tormented souls wandering the train's impossible corridor, I recognized a face I never expected to see there. My mother, Lillian. The shock was so great that for a moment I forgot all the horror around me. She sat alone on one of the rotting seats, her figure looking smaller and more fragile than he had ever seen her. "Mother." My voice came out as a hoarse whisper, barely audible over the groans and creaks of the hellish train. She didn't respond. Her eyes, always hard and critical before, were now focused on something only she could see. His face, which usually wore a mask of bitterness and resentment, was contorted into an expression of pure terror. The shadows around him seemed thicker, more active, as if they were feeding on his suffering. I approached her, fighting the impossible geometry of the train, where each step seemed to take me further from my destination. The shadows began to whisper, their voices like sharp blades cutting through the air. "Look who arrived. The son of the unbeliever. She denied the light and taught her son to do the same. Now they are both here, where they always belonged." The voices mingled, creating a cacophony of accusations and taunts. Some spoke in languages I had never heard, but somehow I could understand their evil meaning. I tried to reach my mother, but it was as if there was an invisible barrier between us. "Lillian," one of the shadows said, using a voice that was a grotesque imitation of mine, "do you remember when your son first tried to talk about God? How you laughed at him? How you said it was for weak people?" Another shadow manifested, "And when he cried at night, asking for divine help, you called him pathetic, too." I tried to scream, but my voice seemed to be swallowed by the darkness. It was then that I saw something that broke my heart, tears streaming down my mother's face. They weren't normal tears, they were dark, almost black, as if they were stained with all the bitterness she carried in life. His body trembled slightly, and his lips moved in a silent cry for help. Suddenly I began to see flashes of her past, as if some force was showing me scenes I had never witnessed. I saw a young Lillian, not much older than a teenager, kneeling in a church, praying fervently. I saw how her faith was broken by a series of tragedies and disappointments. I saw how each blow of life hardened her, how each loss made her build higher walls around herself. "Do you see now?" A voice different from the others spoke, clearer and more penetrating. "See how pride can be a prison. Your mother wasn't born like this, without faith, without hope. She chose this path, decision for decision, rejection for rejection. And you, her son, followed the same path." I watched as the shadows danced around her, occasionally taking shapes that reminded her of people from her past. An absent father, a husband who abandoned her, friends who betrayed her. Each shadowy figure seemed to carry a painful memory, a time when she chose to harden her heart rather than allow herself to be healed. "Mom, I'm sorry," I finally managed to say. "I'm sorry for holding so much grudge, for blaming you for everything." At that moment, something extraordinary happened. For a brief moment, his eyes met mine. There was no longer that usual harshness, just a deep fear and a silent plea for help. It was the first time I saw my mother as she really was, not the bitter woman I knew, but a lost and hurting soul, as scared and confused as I was. The train made an impossible turn, and the darkness seemed to grow even thicker. The shadows continued their relentless torment, but now I understood something fundamental. Both my mother and I were victims of our own choices, prisoners of a cycle of hurt and resentment that had poisoned our souls for generations. It was at the deepest moment of my despair, seeing my mother in that state, that something extraordinary happened. In the midst of that oppressive darkness, I noticed a point of light. At first, it was just a faint, almost imperceptible glow, but it gradually grew. It was unlike any light I had ever seen. It didn't hurt my eyes, even though it was intensely bright. The presence of this light caused an immediate agitation in that environment. The shadows that tormented us began to retreat, as if that glare hurt them. The moans and screams that filled the room diminished, replaced by a silence that, for the first time, was not terrifying. It was a silent reverence. Then I heard a voice. It wasn't like the threatening voices from before. This one was different. It was as if he spoke directly to my soul, without using words in the ordinary sense. It was a voice that conveyed unconditional love, something I had never experienced before. There was no judgment in her, just infinite understanding and compassion. The light began to show me scenes from my life, but from a completely different perspective. I saw how every choice I made had consequences that went far beyond what I could have imagined. I saw how my resentment toward my mother had created a barrier not only between us, but also between me and any possibility of spiritual growth. The most impressive thing is that I didn't feel judged when I saw my mistakes. It was as if that presence showed me that despite all my flaws, I was still deeply loved. For the first time in my life, I felt like someone saw me completely, all the good and all the bad within me, and still accepted me. The light also showed me something about my mother that I had never understood before. I saw how she herself was a wounded soul, carrying pain that came from long before I was born. I saw how her pride and bitterness were actually a protection she had built against further suffering. It wasn't a justification for his actions, but it helped me understand. In a moment that felt eternal and instantaneous at the same time, I felt a peace I had never known. It was as if all the broken pieces inside me were starting to come back together again. I realized that that light wasn't just a light. It was love in its purest form. It was what some people call God, although no words seem enough to describe it. The transformation was instantaneous. One moment he was surrounded by the suffocating darkness of the hellish train. The next I found myself enveloped by a light that defied description. It wasn't like sunlight, nor any artificial light I've ever known. It was a living, conscious light that seemed to penetrate every part of my being. Malachi, I heard my name being called, not with sounds, but directly into my soul. The voice, if I can call it that, was unlike anything I've ever experienced. It was as if all the love in the universe had been concentrated in a single moment of communication. You have carried so much weight, the presence continued. Look at your life through my eyes. And so I did. It was as if a veil had been lifted, and I was able to see every moment of my existence from a completely new perspective. Every wrong choice, every moment of pain, every broken relationship, everything had a greater purpose that I had never been able to see. But there is something else you need to see, the presence continued, something that goes beyond your personal journey. It was then that I received one of the most impactful messages of my experience. A clear and unambiguous vision about November 2024 unfolded before me. I saw profound changes approaching, transformations that would affect not just a few people, but all of humanity. What are you showing me? I asked, though not in words. A time of great transformation approaches. The answer came with crystal clarity. November 2024 will be a portal, a time when the veils between the physical and the spiritual will become thinner. Many will need to be prepared spiritually for what is to come. The images I saw were simultaneously disturbing and hopeful. It was as if the world was reaching a crucial turning point, a moment when each individual's choices would carry even greater weight. Why are you showing me this? I asked. Because you have experienced both sides, the deepest darkness and the purest light. You understand now that there is no real separation between you and others. The pain you carried, the emptiness you tried to fill with drugs, the resentment at your mother, all of this is part of a larger web of spiritual connections. As the presence spoke, I felt an unconditional love that dissolved all the barriers I had built throughout my life. I saw how my suffering had not been a punishment, but a necessary path to my awakening. Forgiveness, the presence continued, is not just a word or a single act. It is a complete transformation of the way you see yourself and others. In that moment, I was flooded with a profound understanding about the nature of forgiveness. I saw how hard I had been on myself, how I carried a guilt that consumed me inside. But more than that, I saw how this weight had affected not just me, but everyone around me. And my mother? I asked, remembering the terrifying sight of her on the train. Your mother is on her own journey. What you saw was not a final destination, but a wake-up call. Just as you are being given this chance for transformation, others will have their opportunities as well. But time is precious. The presence then showed me how my experience with addiction had actually been a distorted search for spiritual connection. Each time I used drugs, I was unconsciously trying to achieve something transcendent, something that I now understood could only be found through a very different path. The coming changes, the presence explained, are not to be feared, but understood. November 2024 will be a time of awakening for many, but also of great challenges. Those who are spiritually prepared will be able to help others navigate this period. It was as if every word, every revelation, was being engraved not just in my mind, but in my very soul. The message was clear. I had received this experience not just for my own transformation, but as part of something much larger. Remember, the presence concluded, the darkness you experienced was not your punishment, but a reflection of the state of your soul. Now that you have known the light, you have the responsibility to keep it burning within you. The coming time will demand this of you and many others. Returning to my body was as intense an experience as leaving. It was like being sucked back through a tunnel of light, but this time the sensation was different. There was no fear or despair, just a deep certainty that he was returning transformed. I remember the exact moment I felt my physical body again. It was like putting on heavy clothing after floating freely. The first physical sensation I felt was a sharp pain in my chest. My lungs burned as if I hadn't been breathing for a long time. I opened my eyes and found myself lying on the floor of my apartment. Apparently, I had fallen off the couch at some point. Dawn light streamed in through the window, and each ray of sunlight seemed to have a special meaning that I had never noticed before. The paramedics later told me that a neighbor had called 911 when they heard falling noises in my apartment. According to them, I had been technically dead for a few minutes, As they examined me and took me to the ambulance, I felt strangely calm despite the physical pain. It was as if my body was in chaos, but my soul was at complete peace. At the hospital, the doctors were surprised by my recovery. They talked about how lucky I had been, about how my heart had stopped and started beating again in a way they couldn't fully explain. As they discussed medical terms and tests, I smiled internally, knowing that I had experienced something that was far beyond scientific understanding. The first days after returning were the most difficult physically. My body was weakened from the overdose and near-death experience. I had constant pain, nausea, and a feeling of weakness that seemed to never end, but mentally and spiritually, I had never felt so strong and clear. Every breath felt like a precious gift. The colors seemed more vivid, the sounds clearer. It was like I was experiencing the world with a new set of senses. The people who visited me in the hospital noticed something different about me, even if they couldn't explain what. Some said my eyes were different, more alive. The first night I spent alone in the hospital room was especially memorable. As I looked out the window at the night sky, I felt immense gratitude for being alive. It wasn't just the relief of having survived. It was a deep appreciation for the opportunity to live again, this time with a clear purpose. The weeks following my experience were a time of profound transformation. The first thing I did after being released from the hospital was to seek help to get rid of my addictions. It wasn't easy. The physical dependence was still there, and the withdrawals were terrible, but something had changed inside me. I now had an inner strength that I had never known before. I voluntarily entered a rehabilitation clinic. Unlike the other times I tried to treat myself, this time I was completely committed to my recovery. The counselors noticed that there was something different about my attitude. While other patients struggled with denial or resistance to treatment, I embraced each step of the process with a serenity that surprised everyone. During therapy sessions, it was difficult to talk about my near-death experience. How do you explain something so deep and personal to people who might think it was just a drug-induced delusion? So at first I kept a lot to myself. I focused on working on my recovery day by day, using what I had learned as a silent inner strength. One of the most significant changes was my new relationship with spirituality. I didn't join any specific religion, but I developed a daily practice of meditation and prayer. It was nothing formal or ritualistic. It was more like an intimate conversation with that presence of light that I had known. Sometimes I would just sit in silence and feel that same peace that I experienced during my experience. I also started making practical changes in my life. I went back to school, first completing my high school education through an adult program. I got a simple but honest job at a building materials store. For the first time in my life, I didn't care about status or what others thought of me. There was a deep satisfaction in simply living an honest and clean life. The most challenging thing was dealing with people from my past. Some old party friends didn't understand my change and tried to convince me to go back to my old life. It took a lot of strength to stand my ground and set clear boundaries. Little by little, I started building new friendships, meeting people who shared values that were more aligned with my new way of seeing life. I can't say it was an instantaneous or magical transformation. There were difficult days, moments of doubt and temptation, but the memory of that experience, both the horror and the light, kept me on the right path. It was like I had an inner north now, a compass that always pointed in the right direction. One of the most significant changes after my experience was in relation to my mother, Lillian. After having seen her soul in that dark place, I could no longer look at it the same way. The first time I visited her after my initial recovery was an emotionally charged moment. She had heard about my overdose, but chose not to visit me in the hospital. Our relationship was so frayed that not even a near-death experience had been enough to break that barrier. I went into her house on a Sunday afternoon. The place still had that same heavy look that I remembered from childhood. Lillian was sitting in her favorite armchair, older than I remembered, with that hard expression I knew so well. But now I could see beyond that mask of hardness. I could see the pain and fear hidden in his eyes. Our conversation started tensely and superficially, as always. She made some scathing comments about my appearance, about how I had finally decided to stop killing myself. In other times, this would have made me furious, but now I could see the fear behind his words. It was the fear of a mother who didn't know how to express concern any other way. So I did something I had never done before. I started talking openly about my feelings. I told her about my experience, not all the details, but enough for her to understand the depth of the transformation I had experienced. I talked about how I had learned about forgiveness and understanding, and for the first time in my life, I apologized for all the times I blamed her for my own bad choices. Her reaction surprised me. I saw his defenses begin to fall, slowly. It wasn't a dramatic change. My mother was still the same skeptical, difficult person, but something had changed. She listened to me without making jokes or sarcastic comments about religion. In a particularly touching moment, I saw tears in her eyes, something I had never seen before. Little by little, we began to build a new way of relating. It wasn't perfect. We still had our moments of tension and disagreement, but there was a new foundation of mutual respect. I started visiting her more often, sometimes just to have a coffee in silence. She never admitted it openly, but I could tell she started to appreciate my presence. The most interesting thing was watching how she also started to change, albeit subtly. He didn't become a religious or spiritual person, but I noticed that his bitterness began to lessen. It was as if my own transformation had opened a small crack of light in his world too. It's been a few years since my near-death experience, and I still wake up every day with the same certainty I had upon returning. Life is a precious gift. I'm no longer the lost, self-destructive person I once was. I also haven't become any kind of guru or spiritual leader. I'm just someone who has had the chance to see beyond the veil that separates this life from something much greater. Many people ask me if I'm afraid of death now. The truth is no. Not that I want to die, on the contrary. I've learned to love life in a way I never imagined possible. But that paralyzing fear of death that I think we all carry on some level simply doesn't exist anymore. I know there is something beyond, even if I can't explain exactly what it is. My life today is simple, and I like it that way. I continue working at the construction materials store, where I was promoted to manager. I have a small apartment that I always keep clean and organized, quite a change for someone who lived in total chaos. On the weekends, I sometimes go fishing in the James River, something I've come to appreciate for the peace it brings me. I built new friendships, people who knew me in this new phase of life. It's interesting how we attract people who vibrate at the same frequency as us. My new friends are simple, honest people who value a good conversation more than a night of partying. I also keep in touch with some fellow recoverers. There's a special bond between people who have been at rock bottom and found the strength to climb out. My relationship with my mother continues to evolve. She still lives alone. She is still a difficult person in many ways, but there is a new understanding between us. We have dinner together once a week, and although our conversations aren't always deep, there's a mutual respect we've never had before. When I think about everything I've been through, I feel deep gratitude, not just for surviving, but for having had the opportunity to see life from a completely different perspective. I know my experience may seem unbelievable to many, and that's okay. I don't try to convince anyone. I just share my story when I feel it can help someone. What I've learned, most of all, is that no matter how long we spend in darkness, there is always the possibility of finding the light. Sometimes you need to hit rock bottom to look up. Today, I live one day at a time, trying to be a better person than I was yesterday, and for me, that's more than enough.